Thank you, Nick. Our first question is from Pauline Wilson. So if she would like to go to the intervention mic to ask a supplementary when we get to that stage. We've had a number of questions submitted on zero-hour contracts. This particular question is, please do not get rid of zero-hour contracts. It works for my grandson to be able to work when he is at home from university.
Well, I think zero contract hours, which have increased dramatically in recent years, do pose a dilemma, actually. And I think we all heard earlier from Vince how he's, I think, very sensibly grappling with it. On the one hand, well, as the questioner has suggested, there might well be a case for that flexibility. It might suit some people, both employers and employees, but it mustn't be, flexibility must not topple into exploitation or undue and unwarranted levels of insecurity. And that's why the fact that Vince has announced, and we've secured agreement across the coalition, that he'll be looking into some of the more worrisome aspects of it, I think is important. Notably, some of these arrangements where someone's on a zero hours contract, which, let's remember, means you could be contracted to an employer but not work for them at all and not be paid for anything. That's the nub of it, and in its most extreme negative form. And I think Vince, quite rightly, is shining a spotlight on those arrangements where you have an exclusive relationship with an employer, where even though there's no guarantee your employer might actually give you a work under the zero-hour contract, you're not allowed to go and work elsewhere or look for work in parallel with other employers. And there are other issues around zero contract hours that need to be looked at, and I think it's a really good thing that it's been announced at this conference, nowhere else. Ed Miliband can talk as much as he likes from the sidelines, but it is at this conference that the announcement has been made that the government is going to both take this seriously, look at it carefully, and take action where justified. Thank you.
Pauline, do you have a supplementary?
Just to say, I'd appreciate the fact that we're looking into it, but I don't want to see it as an outright rule. I still want the flexibility so that my son, when he comes home from university, he can actually go and do some work, which all goes towards his CV.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Take from the hall.
Any questions on that or things related to that? Linda, surely. Linda Jack, always. Oh, you're saving up for something later, right? Okay, right. It's an annual occasion now. The Linda Nick show. No? Nobody? Nobody?
Well, let's move on to the next question then.
Yeah.
The next question is from Richard Rolls, and we've had a number of questions around the economy debate this morning.
Yeah.
With the passing of this morning's motion on the economy, are we now fighting for all the people of Britain?
Yes, of course we are. And first, once again, can I repeat what a high-quality debate I thought it was. I think it's just a wonderful demonstration of our democratic virtues and credentials that we can have that kind of debate in the open like this. I just wanted my reflection afterwards, obviously, because I obviously heard Linda and others saying, we're going to somehow lose our soul if we remain committed to the timetable of getting rid of the structural deficit. If I may, just because obviously some of you, some good friends and colleagues, feel that strongly, can I just dwell on that for a minute? Because, joking aside, I do, of course, take very seriously what Linda Jack and others, and Paul Holmes and David Howarth say. I think we need to be very clear about our approach to deficit reduction. Firstly, it is not a sort of alien thing that's been imposed upon us. We went into the 2000 general election with a very, very clear commitment to deal with the structural deficit. In fact, I remember Vince and I being criticised by parts of the media for being too explicit about the savings and cuts needed. So it's not a sort of thing that's been imposed upon us by the Conservatives. We went in with our eyes wide open to the last general election, that whoever was in power next would have to deal with this huge black hole which had opened up in our public finances. And I think it's really important not to somehow almost portray as if we're sort of hapless, passive recipients for this. We actually campaigned on sound finances, because without sound finances, you can't actually build a sound economy. Without a sound economy, you can't build a fair society. That's the first point. The second point is this. It's worth dwelling on what we are actually committed to doing. What we're actually committed to doing is finally getting rid of the structural deficit in 2018, and also at that point seeing debt fall as a ratio of GDP. That's actually the fiscal mandate, so to speak. So again, I sometimes think people think, oh, we're rushing, there's a headlong ideological rush to dealing with the deficit. I really don't think finishing a job at the end of next Parliament can be reasonably described as a headlong rush. If we delay it any further, we delay it into the Parliament after that. We'd spend 3 parliaments trying to sort of fill that black hole in the public finances. And crucially, by the time we get the job done in 2018, I asked my office the other day to dig up for me what the proportion of our national wealth of GDP would be devoted to public spending. And it's just over 40% in 2018 will, after all of these gory cuts and savings, be devoted to public spending. That is almost exactly where it was under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair before the banks crashed in 2008. This is not some ideological small state agenda. I promise you, spending over 40% of your GDP on public spending after all these savings is not some right-wing Republican agenda. We wouldn't tolerate that. I wouldn't tolerate. It's not what we are doing in government. More than that, actually what we're going to do over the next few years is less steep in terms of the savings we're having to make, the so-called fiscal contraction in that jargon, than what they're, for instance, doing in the United States and France. Is it a job I relish or any of us? No, of course not. I don't think any of us came into politics saying we're going to be the lot who are going to make lots of cuts and savings. But is it in any way the kind of caricatured ideological thing that's being imposed upon us by Tories, and we're just haplessly receiving? I just don't think any of the facts sustain that caricature. And I say that not to deliver a sort of belated riposte, because I just really want all of us now to come together after this very important debate and understand that what we're doing is in line with what we said before the last general election, before we went into coalition. It's in line with what other centre-left governments are doing elsewhere in the world, and we're taking it actually at quite a measured pace compared to other similar economies around the world. And crucially, final point, as I said earlier, just because you're doing that doesn't mean you can't have different policies on how you make up taxes and spending, what you spend on public services. I'll give you an example. I intervened directly myself after the 2010 general election in the comprehensive spending round in the internal discussions within government when we initially decided that we were going to protect NHS spending compared to the savings we're asking of other public services, 20% savings, for instance, in police. And I intervened directly and said we must also provide the same protection to school spending. So we protected NHS and schools spending. We've done that between 2010 and 2015. My personal view, we'll need to discuss it, but my personal view is we should do that again from 2015 to 2020 and make sure that one of the bedrocks of our approach, our Liberal Democrat approach, is that as we continue to make savings, as we clear the decks up to 2018, we don't make savings in the schools budget and the NHS budget, which I don't think is consistent with our values. We are totally free to make those decisions. We don't have to ask the permission of George Osborne or anybody else. All we're doing is we're saying that we make those sovereign choices as Liberal Democrats within a framework of sticking to a plan of dealing with the structural deficit by 2018.
Thank you. Richard, do you have a supplementary?
Yes. My question was in relation to the growth motion. And the motion itself, I think if we're talking about restoring a level of growth above the rate of inflation that the regular people in the country experience, then we're actually going to get somewhere, because we're fighting for all of Britain. We do lots of good things like fighting for the poor and the homeless and everything else, but there's so many people out there who we talk to on the doorstep, and they're struggling to pay their mortgage. They're struggling to save for their children's future. And I suppose the depth behind the question was trying to get to the point that we have to focus on those people, because when we knock on their door, we have to look them in the eye and say, we're fighting for you as well.
Of course, and a return to what the economists in the jargon call sort of trend rate growth, or ideally even eventually above it, is immensely important to provide a long-term alleviation to those many, many millions of people who've seen their living standards squeezed, whose earnings often haven't kept up with prices. There was, in my view, by the way, one of the cruelest things that happened that we don't actually talk about very much was the very sharp spike in inflation about 18 months ago, and up to about 5.2%. Inflation is deeply regressive, deeply regressive. Ask anyone who dealt with the higher electricity and gas bills that winter, people on low incomes, and you know what I mean. And when people say, oh, well, we should, that's why I think you can't be sort of casual about things like monetary policy, because a spike in, that spike in inflation was principally because of higher oil and gas prices, which we can't, of course, influence. But we should never, ever be cavalier about inflation. It's a horrid thing, for as you say, that the vast majority of ordinary families in this country who face prices which gallop well ahead of what they feel they can afford.
Take some supplementary.
I'm being uncharacteristically brief, you see. It's catching you out. But there's only one hand up, I think. Two. No, sorry, Katie. Oh, and Linda. Well, you only get one go, Linda. You know that.
Hi, Nick. Richard Flowers from Tower Hamlets. The statistic that I've been most proud to see recently is that for the first time in 30 years, income inequality in this country has actually come down. And surely that's got to be to do with Danny Alexander being listened to in the Treasury. The question, I suppose, is do you think Gordon Brown and Ed Balls would have listened as much if we'd been in a Labour coalition as perhaps the Tories have listened to us in this one?
That's a parlour game I don't think I'm going to enter into about what it would have been like to have been in coalition with Labour. I mean, who knows? Who knows? I tell you what, I sometimes hear, and I think you and I may have spoken about it, because, I think it'd be nicer to be in a coalition with this party, or nicer to be in... Don't go into coalition if you want to sort of have a nice time. It's not a walk in the park. It is hard work battling out these compromises, and it's a constant daily, not trial, but you need to really dig deep every day to make sure that we don't allow our values to be compromised, that we do stand up for ourselves. And I personally think, I really feel this very strongly, that would be the case whoever you're in coalition with. Being a smaller party in any coalition government is a great privilege, of course, but it means whoever you're in coalition with, you need to make sure that your voice is heard. And I'll be saying more about that in my speech on Wednesday, revealing a bit more about how I seek to try and make the choices about the battles you fight, the battles you don't, where you dig a trench, what you call a red line, and so on and so forth. And I think we're all getting used to, the country is getting used to coalition government. And my sincerely held view is that if there's one thing that could jeopardize the emerging recovery more than almost anything else, is if we hand the keys to number 10 back to either Labour or the Conservatives outright to mess things up all over again in a single-party government. I genuinely think we have now emerged as the sort of guarantor of a sensible approach to the economy if we're ever in coalition with the Labour Party, and of greater social fairness in any coalition with the Conservatives. As they pull left and right, we really need to be proud of the fact that we speak to those very many people across Britain who aren't attracted by polarised politics, but do want people who combine these two virtues. Linda.
Nick, I'm sure like others this morning, I left the hall wondering if there was still a place for me in this party. And if so, why? Because all I see is what appears to be an abandonment of our values. When you look at the bedroom tax, when you look at some of the other changes to benefits that have hit the most vulnerable, when we say that, that no one should be enslaved by poverty, ignorance, or conformity, I find it really hard to hang on. And to be honest, at the moment, it's only the Glee Club that keeps me here.
Right. Look, Linda, I'm not going to pretend to you that I don't find some of the individual decisions, particularly on welfare reform, really difficult, really, really difficult. I mean, you'd have to be made of sort of granite not to wrestle with some of these things. But to be fair, that wasn't actually the subject of the discussion this morning. The subject of the discussion this morning was, how do we say to the British people that it is an impeccably liberal, progressive, liberal democrat thing to provide stability where the economy needs stability? And I cannot stress enough that being predictable about what you do on filling the structural deficit over many, many years, and predictable about how you let the Bank of England get on with its job, it's just, as I said earlier, it's the goalposts which sort of frame the overall choice of policies you make. I think you have to keep those in place and then take a whole lot of decisions which clearly distinguish us from other parties. And you've had it in the motion today. You know, we're the first party to say, loud and clear, we've adopted this motion today, that we think that local authorities should be released from some of the strictures of the Treasury and allowed to basically borrow money from each other so that they can build more houses. Not tomorrow, not mañana, not in 10 years' time, now. We're the party that's saying that we need to use the business bank, Vince's business bank, over time to do something like they do in Germany, where you have a network of banks which have a much stronger link with a locality and a region and only serve that locality and region. That's a really exciting, radical vision of how to reform the banking system. Or that we should release the Green Investment Bank from the strictures that, again, the Treasury has imposed upon it, to really allow it to fly, to borrow in its own accord, to invest in green. These aren't little sort of smidgens of inter-party compromises within the coalition. That is a genuinely exciting approach to some of the big economic issues facing us. But I don't think we should in any way be sheepish about being proud of the fact that we've set out a course for how the economy will grow over a period of time, and we don't want to completely upset the apple cart. Because bluntly, if you do that, what the result is higher unemployment, is possibly a higher interest rates, and that only has regressive effects. But on welfare, which is a totally different discussion, I wrestle with these things myself. And on the spare bedroom subsidy, for instance, I think the issue there, candidly, the problem, I was talking to the leader of Glasgow City Council about it just an hour ago or so, is that the reason this change is being introduced, I think most people accept. Because, of course, it was a previous government, supported by Labour, that actually made exactly this change in the private rented sector. In other words, that if you receive housing benefit and you're renting a home in the private rented sector, you only get the amount of housing benefit you need for the number of bedrooms you need. Everybody also accepts we've got a problem of overcrowding. 250,000 households living in overcrowded accommodation, where kids don't have a bedroom of their own, don't have a place to do homework, and yet we have 1 million households who've got bedrooms which they don't need. And we somehow have to make sure that these two fit. So I think most people understand that it makes sense to change the system. It's how do we make sure that we properly help those households and individuals who get caught out when these rules suddenly change, when they've been living quite reasonably expecting that the rules are going to carry on in one way and then they suddenly change. And that's, of course, without going into lots of detail, why I intervened in the summer, massively increased the pot of money, the discretionary housing payment, trebled it actually in total now, so that councils really do have the means to help people. But that's the rationale. But that doesn't in any way mean that there aren't individual cases which, as I say, my heart goes out to those people who find themselves caught out, and that's why I'm so keen we keep how this is working in practice and how councils help them and the means they've got to do so constantly under review. Can I? Yep.
Thank you. Nick, in the preamble to the Constitution, we say that the cooperative approach to economics is fundamental to liberal democracy. In both the paper that was backing the debate this morning and in the actual debate, the word cooperative was mentioned just once. And yet, when you look at what we're actually doing with the credit unions, when you look at what we're doing in terms of the expansion of the ability of businesses to be putting surplus food back into the food chain for the poorest through the food banks, when you look at other work that we're doing, we're actually doing a tremendous amount to support the cooperatives. When are we going to actually start saying that we are a cooperative party, that we are the only independent cooperative party, and that the cooperative movement will be supported by us? Because we're doing a lot of work, but we're not saying it.
I think it's a very good point, and of course it's such a sort of strongly liberal, sort of Grimond-esque idea that we're trying to rewire the way in which capitalism works, in the way in which ownership works, that we're trying to give employees greater stake, whether it's in a lot of the new incentives we've given to companies to turn companies into sort of John Lewis-style employee-owned companies, whether it's some of the things that we're doing, for instance, for Royal Mail staff, but also the cooperative approaches that we're taking elsewhere. I mean, I regularly try to kind of promote and publicise what we're doing on this. I don't know. Sometimes people, I think it's rather sort of techie and rather dry, but it's actually it's a really good old-fashioned idea which has a very contemporary relevance given how public confidence in the way things which are run and how ownership works has been so badly shaken by the crisis of 2008. So look, I'm basically with you. If you've got any ideas, stick it on a postcard and I'll be very keen to take it up.
Thank you.
Katie, do I have one more?
One more and then we'll move
Katie.
on.
Katie Gordon, Glasgow South. In the economic debate this morning, I wish what had happened on Amendment 1 had happened on Amendment 2 because we had the separate votes. I really liked the stuff on housing, and a lot of people in the debate were very much in favour of it. What I liked the most was the big, bold target of 300,000 a year. And I'm wondering what you think the merits are in having that kind of target, because I don't really know why we didn't have a separate vote, but I'm keen on the idea of demonstrating how committed we are to properly building our way to more housing.
Yeah, well, I totally. I mean, it was a sort of head and heart thing, wasn't it? My heart sings when you see pieces of paper. So we're going to build 300,000 homes. We must do so. And X% of them should be social homes. Which Liberal Democrat is going to disagree with that? That really wasn't the question, actually. The question was, what is the best way to get to that objective? And, we have always been fierce critics of politicians and governments and parties in the past that pronounce great targets but have got no realistic way of delivering them. And I think the point that I was making to others was not that John Shipley and others were right in highlighting the woeful levels of house construction, home construction, and particularly the woeful levels of construction of new affordable homes, but was how do you get there and get there as quickly as possible? And it's just my genuinely held belief that if we'd deleted the bit in the motion, which actually presents us with the opportunity of finding up to £3 billion pretty quickly to allow local authorities to build more affordable homes, that would have been a great target, but the questions then would have been, well, how are you going to deliver this? When are you going to deliver this? And then, of course, setting out this intermediate step, which is this review. Again, really techie, really dry, really important, actually, is how do you define debt? How do you define public debt? Because at the moment, as you know, we have a definition which constrains, or rather includes, the liabilities and the borrowing powers of local authorities. There's another definition which the European Union, the IMF, the OECD, and other countries use. And here's the irony. They use this different definition, I think the acronym is GGGD, and it would allow the local authorities, if you like, off the leash, good thing, box ticked, because they'd be able to invest more of that money into housing, but actually you'd have to include a lot of the liabilities which presently aren't included in the measure of public debt, like the taxpayer-funded liabilities in the banking system and other what they call liquid assets. And that actually ironically means that you'd be allowing the local authorities off the hook, but your debt would go through the roof. And I just I don't know about you, I just don't think we can take a huge step like that, in a sense, on a whim. Let's do what the motion said, which I think is a really sensible thing. No other party's doing it. Let's commission urgently review to look at the merits and the pros and cons of making that change from one definition of debt to another, which is so relevant to this issue of the freedom that we do or don't give to local authorities to build more homes. Right, next question, I think.
Thank you. Yep, we're going to move on to a different subject area now, relating around young people. It's from Lisa Smart from Stockport. I've read recently that we are looking at ways to give young people access to free local transport. Yes. Is this correct?
Yes, absolutely. You're quite right. This sort of bubbled up in the newspapers a bit over the summer. No, it's something I've been looking very actively at, and I've asked Norman Baker and David Laws to do some work for all of us on this. At the moment, we've got, I think, a wholly unfair system where if you're a 17-year-old going to college or to your local employer in London to do your apprenticeship, you get free bus travel. If you're a 17-year-old in Yeovil, you might have to pay hundreds of pounds travelling probably longer distances if you live in the countryside to do exactly the same thing. It cannot be right at a time when we've got high youth unemployment. We're desperately trying to give youngsters the opportunity, wherever they live in the country, to have access to education, to training, to apprenticeships, that this huge cost of living is not imposed upon you in some parts of the country and it is on others. And I really, really want us to, if we can, find a way of smoothing this out and making sure everybody, all youngsters, have got a chance to either have reduced or, I suppose, ideally, free particularly bus transport travel. However, getting that right, getting the details right, working with the bus companies, working with the local authorities. Do you do an across-the-board deduction? How do you do it? And frankly, how much will it cost? Because it's a pretty expensive thing to do, hundreds of millions of pounds, is all the detail we're filling in. But I mean, I don't know what other people feel. I really think this is something that we should try and deliver in government, coalition government, if we can. We've got, 2 or 3 budgets and autumn statements still to go. And if we can't do it with the Conservatives, we should do it, I think, certainly make a commitment in our next manifesto, because I find over and over again as I go around the country that youngsters, teenagers say to me over and over again, help us with transport costs. This is really hurting us, and I hope we as a party will be able to help them.
Lisa, do you have a supplementary?
I do. Thanks, Nick. I'd welcome what you've just said there. On a slightly linked matter, I wonder what more you think we can do to encourage families to walk or cycle to school.
Well, I think there are a whole lot of things we can do, and I think Norman Baker, to be fair, I think he's been an incredibly active transport minister, particularly on encouraging people onto bicycles, and crucially making sure that local authorities in partnership with central government have got the infrastructure to make sure that walkways, footpaths, bicycle routes are more readily available to people. I mean, we are still so far behind other countries in terms of really having a kind of proper bicycling, kind of pedestrian culture. It varies. Some cities and towns are better and some communities than others, but I think we've got a long, long way still to go. Silenced everybody, right? Yeah. It's coming round. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike Hibbs, Saffron Walden. The last government did away with the statutory requirement for county councils to provide a youth service. It's now the case right across the country that other political parties are doing away with youth clubs. And in Essex, the Conservative County Council have done so, leaving it to the charitable sector to provide something for young people to do. Unfortunately, there's no money. What can we do about it?
Well, we can, I think, like all duties, expectations, statutory obligations or aspirations asked of local government, all of you working in local government know this better than I do. There's this painful daily, weekly, ongoing dilemma of how on earth local government meets the needs of the communities that local governments serve, but with less money. And I think this is a rather sweeping kind of answer, but I think it really does go to the heart of it. We need to move towards a world where local government has far more freedom about how money is both raised and spent, even as the cash which is provided by central government diminishes or is limited. And that's what, some of these big changes, the retention of 50% of locally raised business rates, the city deals, something I've been very involved with, giving our big cities far, far more financial freedom to raise money, to, in some cases, borrow money and to spend it where they think they should, and the lifting of all of the ring fences on some of the statutory areas of local government expenditure. I think all of that is the only way we can square the circle. If there's less, if the central state is cash-strapped, and it will be for some time, for all the reasons we debated this morning, it seems to me if there's less cash, we've got to give more freedom, and that's what I think needs to lie at the heart of our thinking on all of this for the foreseeable future. Can I take one more? Yep.
Hi, thanks. Matthew Halbert, I'm a councillor in Hinckley and Bosworth and the Children and Young People's Champion in Hinckley and Bosworth because we run the council there. I just wanted to say, yeah, we still run the council there after 2011. It's fantastic. I just wanted to say, Nick, when I can refine my words, I think this is a really big issue for young people, especially in rural areas like Hinckley and Bosworth. And I think having free transport for young people, yes, of course, very expensive, I don't deny that, but would be a hugely popular move, especially as Tory-run county councils, including in Leicestershire, are making transport cuts the whole time. And our local members of the Youth Parliament are campaigning for this, as I'm sure you're aware. So, I mean, just an encouragement, please try and achieve it. Tell the Tories needs to be done.
No, look, maybe we need to debate this at our next party conference, maybe in the spring in York or whatever. But look, my personal view is this would be a really good thing for many, many youngsters who deserve more help to get into work, into training, into apprenticeships and so on. But look, we need to take this. Does if you did it like they do in London, I mean, it costs you hundreds of millions of pounds. And I personally am persuaded this is pretty close up to the top of my kind of list of priorities, but there are a whole lot of other competing priorities on welfare, on education, on policing, on transport, and it's one of the things we're all going to have to juggle together and collectively, certainly in the run-up to our manifesto, is which of these nice-to-have things we really, really want to do, which are in line with our values, are ones that we really feel we can commit to because we can find the money, and which do we think we won't be able to deliver immediately. But I mean, I certainly spent a lot of time with Norman and David over the summer looking at the details, and I think we could do something with the right political will and indeed the means if we can get all that right in the months and years to come.
I want to move on to another subject area, and that's immigration. We've had a number of cards in on immigration. The one I'm going to take is from Merlene Emerson from Twickenham, Richmond. In July, we saw the Home Office start a campaign with poster vans and immigration raids. Do you support their campaign?
I said at the time, and I've said several times, I thought these vans were just so silly. I mean, more than silly. They were very unsettling and offensive, I think, in some of the communities where they were being piloted. But I use the word silly because if one of the things I think any government needs to do, we're trying to do this, difficult to get the balance right, which is inspire public confidence in the way in which the immigration system is run, I think aimlessly driving around in a poster van saying, can you please perhaps go home, is hardly the way to inspire confidence that you know what you're up to. And, And there's a very serious sort of tough and tender point to all of this, which is that I personally do not think that you can encourage a culture of tolerance, of being generous-spirited and open-hearted as we are as a country at our very best, if people think that the authorities of the day just don't even know how to work out who on earth is coming in and out of the country. And so I've never felt it's inconsistent in saying that you can take a liberal approach to immigration, where we welcome people to this country who want to contribute, who need to seek refuge, who have every right to come to this country, but at the same time say that we got to be tough about how we run the system. I don't think, for instance, Liberal Democrats should ever be relaxed about the huge scale of what they call visa overstaying. There's nothing good about issuing visas saying that someone can, come to the country for 3 years and everyone merrily stays for 6 or more. And if you have a visa system, it's got to sort of mean what it says on the visa kind of, stamp. And that's why I've been constantly going on about, in government and indeed outside government, and indeed we did as a party before the last general election, the need to reintroduce the exit checks at our borders, which both the Labour and the Conservative governments of the past removed, because you can't work out who's overstaying their visas unless you at least have some idea, not only about who's coming into the country, but who's leaving as well. And getting that balance right, I think, is sometimes difficult. Sometimes I think it's important we choose our language right. But I would urge all Liberal Democrats to not be too sheepish about saying that where we need to take tough action to make the immigration system just work, just be more effective and less incompetent, That's not an illiberal thing to do, because unless you do that first, you can't then ask people to be, as I say, open-hearted, generous-minded, generous-spirited, in the way that I think we all believe we should be as a country. Meryl.
Thank you very much for your long answer. In fact, you've touched on many other areas apart from the vans. And clearly, the vans is only a symptom. My issue really is your attitude. Is it in line with the Home Office attitude? Because the vans is clear, it's easy for you to condemn that, but there's actually now a real campaign. And for you to say you condemned it because you didn't know what was happening, you were away on holiday, but there are also raids at the moment to ethnic businesses and restaurants. Are you aware of that? There's at least one Chinese restaurant being shut down in Chinatown at the moment, ever since the end of July. And they would come in a convoy of 4 cars and come and arrest people, but release them the same day. Why? Because many of them are part of the 500,000 unregulated immigrants, and they're being processed, so they're actually technically not illegal because they're waiting for an answer. So there is a bigger issue of incompetence within the Home Office, and we can't then allow this system to carry on without a solution. So there'll be, I'm sure, people asking you about the 10-year amnesty. There are real concerns, for example, about refugees which are lost in the system who can't work. So there are a whole host of practical problems that we need to solve.
No, well, there are a lot of practical problems, and I know as a constituency MP, I mean, I just tear my hair out in frustration sometimes that someone comes into my constituency office on a Thursday, Friday afternoon, and they say, well, you know, we sent in our papers to, you know, the immigration processing service, the border agency, and when I rang up to ask what happened to my papers, they were lost, no one get back to us. And you get this, when the system is incompetent, what it means, quite rightly, as you suggest, is that, not quite rightly that this happens, you quite rightly pointed it out, that people end up in a limbo. And that's why, you know, the fact that for so long, the levels of illegal immigration has somehow been kind of ignored and swept under the carpet is so unacceptable. And I think we should not ever think it's okay to have very, very large numbers of people both entering and living in the country illegally. And that's why I think we should be quite tough in seeking to shine the spotlight on where illegality happens, but be just more competent and indeed more open-minded and more generous-spirited about people who have every legitimate right to seek to come to this country and every legitimate right to be expected allowed to come in, as long as, of course, they abide by the visa rules which they've been issued with.
Thank you. I want to get in two last questions, which we won't take supplementaries for, but I think I think they're questions that really do need answering. This one is from Jane Brophy. Recently, a coalition of environmental NGOs released a document which said that the Lib Dems risk losing our green identity. What do you say to that?
Well, I saw that. I mean, look, I think that's a great pity they said that, because if you look at all the green things that have happened in government, they've happened because of Liberal Democrats. The Green Investment Bank, the Green Deal, the unbelievably ambitious approach to the carbon budget, even the thing which has been the subject, quite rightly, of a lot of campaigning by green NGOs recently, the decarbonisation target. If I was Prime Minister, we won the election, we would have legislated now for a decarbonisation target. The Conservatives didn't want one at all. Not at all. They didn't want it now. They didn't want a decarbonisation target whatsoever. So Ed Davey, myself, and Danny Alexander and others, we fought for months persuading the Tories that it was totally unacceptable to turn our back on a long-term decarbonisation target, and that's why we're now taking the power in law to set that decarbonisation target, as we will, I think it's in 2016, logically enough, when the new 5th carbon budget is introduced. And look, I suppose it's just part, isn't it, of politics and coalition politics. If you don't achieve 100% of everything that you want, but you achieve 70% of what you want, there are, of course, people who will say, well, why have you not achieved 100%? Well, I tell you, 70% is better than 0%. And I think when we work in harness with green NGOs, and many people, many of you, I suspect, are members of these organisations. We can do great things. We are the best guarantee that this government, and indeed future governments, will remain green.
Thank you. And I'm afraid the final question is from Paula Keaveney. What proportion of our 2015 manifesto should be independent, Lib Dem policy, and what proportion of it do you think it will be?
Well, I'll come to a very simple answer at the end on that. But just before we do, has anyone seen, I just saw on the news earlier this afternoon that the Conservatives, when explaining what their top message is for their conference the week after next, it's raising the income tax allowance. It's really important, this. It's really important. Because before we get on to our next manifesto, I just want to underline to you the importance of celebrating what we've delivered from our last manifesto. That was our manifesto commitment. It was not the Conservatives' commitment. David Cameron told me... David Cameron told me, and you can look it up on YouTube, in one of the leaders' debates in front of millions of people, he said, it can't be done. We did it, not them. We did it. So before we get on to our next manifesto, which I'll come to in a minute, we must never, ever, ever allow the great progressive reforms that we're introducing in this government to be appropriated by others. And then on the question of what proportion of a Liberal Democrat manifesto should be independent Liberal Democrat ideas, all of it. Thank you very much.